Chapter 7. Secrets in the Firelight. Part 1. Shadows and Confessions. Étienne Morel stood by the narrow window of his apartment, his silhouette etched against the faint glow of the gas lamps outside. Rain streaked down the glass in thin rivulets, blurring the city beyond. In the distance, the muted hume of Paris's nightlife whispered beneath the weight of the storm. The mask Henri had left him lay on the desk, cold and expressionless. The letter accompanying it sat unfolded, its words carved into Étienne's memory as if by steel. Tomorrow night, the masquerade at the Palais Royal. Your brother's killer will be there. Étienne's eyes narrowed as he reread the letter for the third time that evening. Camille Laurent sat across the room, wrapped in a shawl, her auburn hair catching the firelight. She hadn't spoken since their return from the Seine. "He gave you this." Camille finally broke the silence, her gaze fixed on the mask. Étienne nodded, but didn't look away from the rain-slicked streets below. "He wants me to attend. Perhaps it's a warning. Or an invitation to watch something unfold." Bruno was startled to hear himself think. His words were unintelligible in the digital speech. Camille exhaled sharply. "And you intend to go?" Étienne turned, his piercing blue-grey eyes locking onto hers. "I don't have a choice. If your husband's murderer will be there, I must find out who it is." Camille's hands tightened around the edge of the shawl. Étienne crossed the room in 2 strides, lowering his voice. "No, this isn't the opera or the archives. The Palais Royal won't tolerate spectators. The faceless are dangerous, and if Henri's warning holds weight, we'll be walking into their den." Camille rose, standing inches from him. Her hazel eyes blazed beneath the shadow of her veil. "I lost Alain because I ignored the signs for too long. I won't sit by while you risk everything to uncover the truth. This isn't just your fight, Étienne." Étienne studied her for a long moment, searching for the right words, but none came. The fire crackled softly behind them, casting long shadows that danced across the room. "Fine," he relented, "but you'll stay close. I won't risk losing someone else to this." "Cloak?" Camille's gaze softened, but her expression remained firm. "Agreed." The weight in Étienne's chest lifted slightly, though the sense of looming danger lingered like a spectre in the room. By the following evening, the rain had ceased, leaving behind damp streets that glistened under the soft glow of Paris's lanterns. The Palais Royal rose ahead of them, its gilded entrance shimmering beneath the faint light of the moon. Carriages lined the square, and masked figures ascended the marble steps, their laughter echoing faintly in the cool air. Étienne adjusted his mask, the porcelain cool against his skin. His dark coat hung heavy over his shoulders, concealing the revolver strapped beneath. Camille, dressed in a midnight blue gown, walked beside him, her delicate mask trimmed with silver lace. They passed through the entrance unnoticed, blending seamlessly with the throng of Parisian elites. The grand hall stretched ahead, adorned with crystal chandeliers that dripped light like liquid gold. Dancers twirled beneath painted ceilings, while clusters of masked guests whispered behind gloved hands. Étienne's gaze swept the room, searching for familiar figures hidden among the crowd. "Do you see him?" Camille whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of conversation. Étienne's eyes narrowed as his attention drifted to the farthest corner of the room, where a gathering of men in silver masks lingered near the balcony. One of them, taller and broader than the rest, turned slightly, catching the light. Étienne's pulse quickened, but he masked his reaction beneath an air of calm. "There," he murmured, tilting his head slightly. "By the balcony." Camille followed his gaze, her breath catching faintly. "What now?" Etienne's lips pressed into a thin line. "We wait. Let them make the first move." As they crossed the ballroom, a masked woman approached, offering Camille a glass of wine. Etienne declined the drink, his focus never wavering from the far side of the room. The masquerade played on, but the undercurrent of danger grew with each passing minute. The hour crept toward midnight, when Henri finally made his move. He slipped from the balcony and disappeared down a corridor that stretched beyond the main hall, shadowed by two masked men. Etienne caught the movement from the corner of his eye and followed at a measured pace, Camille close behind. The corridor was quieter, lined with heavy tapestries that muffled the sounds of the masquerade. The flicker of torches cast wavering silhouettes along the stone walls. Henry paused near a doorway, exchanging quiet words with his companions before stepping inside. Etienne motioned for Camille to stay back. "Wait here. Escort me." Before she could argue, he slipped through the doorway. The room beyond was small, furnished with little more than a writing desk and a single candle flickering in the corner. Henri stood by the window, his mask resting on the desk beside him. Etienne closed the door softly, the faint click echoing between them. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Henri said without turning. Etienne's eyes narrowed. "You knew I would." Henri finally faced him, the scar along his throat catching the candlelight. "It's strange, seeing you here, after all these years. You never did enjoy these kinds of gatherings?" Etienne took a step forward, his hand resting lightly on the revolver beneath his coat. "I'm not here to reminisce. I want answers." Henri's expression darkened slightly. "The answers you seek are dangerous, brother. Some truths are better left buried." Etienne's grip tightened. "Did you kill Alain Laurent?" Henri's gaze hardened, but he did not flinch. "No. But I know who did." Etienne's heart slowed. "Who?" Henri approached the desk, his hand hovering over the mask. "He stands among the faceless tonight. A man named Valette, one of our own." "This meeting has come to an end." "Aha, one of our own." Etienne's mind raced. He had heard the name whispered before, tied to the city's underworld. "Who?" winds up two voice, the temptation demanded. Henri's eyes lowered. "Alain was closer to uncovering our secrets than we allowed. He threatened to expose us, but I wasn't the one who ordered his death." Etienne exhaled slowly, the weight of Henri's words settling heavily over him. Henri took the mask in his hand, fitting it carefully over his face. "Valette will not stop, Etienne. He sees you as a threat." Etienne's jaw tightened. "Let him try." Henri's eyes flickered with something close to pride, but it was fleeting. "Watch your back," Henri murmured as he stepped past him, disappearing into the corridor. "Debtor?" Etienne stood alone for a long moment, the flicker of the candle casting shadows that danced like ghosts across the walls. Etienne stood motionless, his brother's warning hanging in the still air like smoke from a dying fire. The name Valette echoed in his mind, cold and sharp. He had crossed paths with the man before, in whispers from informants and records buried deep within police archives. Valette was not simply a player in the city's underworld, he was a force pulling strings from the dark corners of Paris. But what disturbed Etienne most wasn't the name, it was the realization that Henri had let this happen. He hadn't pulled the trigger, but his silence had sealed Alain Laurent's fate. Etienne's hand fell away from his revolver. Killing Henri now, in this small chamber, would change nothing. There was no way he could flee and get away. Étienne was a dragon. A soft knock at the door stirred him from his thoughts. Camille slipped inside, her eyes darting quickly around the room. "Is he gone?" she whispered. Étienne nodded. "For now." She stepped closer, the soft fabric of her gown rustling in the quiet. "What did he say?" Étienne's gaze shifted to the window, where the faint silhouette of his brother had disappeared into the night. "Your husband's killer is here," Étienne replied, his voice calm but laced with steel. "A man named Valette. Henri confirmed it." The man looked suddenly worried. Camille's breath hitched. "Where?" In the end, therefore, he returns to the dining room. Étienne crossed to the door, pausing before stepping back into the corridor. If he's at this masquerade, he won't stay hidden for long. Men like Valette thrive on power. He'll want to show it. Camille followed closely as they emerged into the hall, weaving silently through the narrowing passageways of the Palais Royal. The sounds of the masquerade drifted distantly behind them, muffled by the thick stone walls. Étienne's sharp eyes swept the corridors, searching for signs of Valette or Henri. He felt Camille's gaze linger on him as they walked, her hands clenching nervously around the folds of her gown. "You believe Henri's telling the truth?" she asked, breaking the silence. Étienne hesitated. "He hasn't lied to me tonight," I nodded. "But you don't trust him." Étienne glanced at her. "I trust him to do what he believes is right. That's not always the same thing." Camille said nothing, but the slight tightening of her jaw revealed her thoughts. As emerged into the grand hall just as the masquerade began to thin. The chandeliers overhead dimmed slightly, signalling the approaching end of the festivities. Étienne's gaze shifted toward the far end of the ballroom, where a small cluster of masked figures stood gathered near the columns. Their movements were subtle, careful, but one man's posture held authority that the others seemed to orbit around. Étienne's breath slowed. The man wore a deep crimson mask, elaborate and edged with gold filigree. His cloak was tailored but unassuming, no doubt to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. Étienne gestured discreetly for Camille to remain near the crowd. She nodded, blending into the swirl of guests as Étienne approached Valette's group, keeping to the shadows that lined the room. As he neared, Valette's gaze shifted slightly, sensing the intrusion. His eyes locked onto Étienne, and, for a brief moment, Étienne caught the faint flicker of recognition behind the mask. But Valette said nothing. Étienne's footsteps slowed just behind the group, his hands hidden beneath his coat. "Impressive gathering," Étienne said, his voice low but cutting through the conversation. Valet turned slightly, head tilting as if to appraise him. "Indeed," he replied smoothly. "But I wasn't aware the Paris police were invited tonight." Étienne's lips curled faintly. "I wasn't aware the faceless were in the habit of attending social events." The air between them shifted, tension crackling beneath the politeness. Violette's eyes narrowed beneath his mask. "Your brother was right. You ask too many questions, Morel." Étienne's pulse quickened. Valette wasn't hiding. He was toying with him, accurately assessing his condition, and then touche, with no time to think. Étienne stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Alain Laurent asked the same questions, didn't he?" Valette's head tilted ever so slightly, as if pondering the thought. "Laurent overstepped. He should have known better." Étienne's hand hovered near the revolver beneath his coat. "And will I suffer the same fate?" Valet's gaze hardened. "Only if you make the same mistake," with his hands up to misfits yelling. Étienne's jaw clenched. "Killing me won't silence this. The faceless may rule from the shadows, but Paris is not blind." Valet's eyes flicked briefly to the crowd. "Perhaps. But Paris forgets quickly, detective. You do well to remember that." The unspoken threat hung between them. Before Étienne could respond, Valette's attention shifted and he stepped away, merging into the mass of masked guests. Étienne remained rooted for a moment, watching him disappear into the crowd. Camille approached quietly, her voice soft but urgent. "What did he say?" Étienne's eyes didn't leave the corridor, where Valette had vanished. "Blowing away," said the woman. "He knows I'm close," Étienne murmured. "And he doesn't care." Camille's hand trembled slightly against his arm. "What now?" Étienne exhaled slowly. "Now we stop watching from the shadows. It's time Paris sees the face beneath the mask." Chapter 8. The Mask Comes Off. Étienne Morel paced the length of his small apartment, the faint creak of floorboards beneath his boots the only sound in the room. Rain lashed against the windows, blurring the lanterns of Paris into golden smears beyond the glass. Camille Laurent sat in the corner near the hearth, silent but restless, the faint glow of the fire casting flickering shadows across her face. The confrontation with Valette at the Palais Royal still played over in Étienne's mind. Valette hadn't tried to deny his involvement in Alain Laurent's death. It hadn't cared that Étienne knew. It was not the response of a man fearful of discovery. It was the response of someone who believed they were untouchable. Étienne's fingers brushed against the edge of the mask Henri had left him, still resting on the desk, like a silent witness to the tangled threads of the case. "We need to force his hand," Étienne muttered, more to himself than Camille. "He's comfortable in the shadows. If Valette believes he's protected by secrecy, we take that away from him." Camille's gaze lifted, sharp beneath the veil of her auburn hair. "How? He operates within circles we can't reach." Étienne stopped pacing and met her eyes. "We can't reach them directly, but we can draw him into the open. Valette may control the faceless, but men like him value one thing above all else: power. If he senses that power slipping, he'll make a mistake." Camille leaned forward slightly, her expression hardening. "And how do we shake that power?" Étienne's lips pressed into a thin line. "By exposing him to those he answers to, no matter the cost. It is my duty to protect their mental health." She frowned. "The faceless?" Étienne nodded, settling into the chair across from her. "Henri said there are factions within their ranks, divisions growing beneath the surface. If we present Valette as a threat to their secrecy, those divisions will widen." Camille considered this carefully, her hazel eyes narrowing in thought. "And Henri, can he be trusted to help with this?" Étienne's gaze drifted to the mask again. "Henri will act in the interest of the faceless, but that may align with our goal. For now. Behavers. Confidentiality granted. Tuscany. Please hold confidentiality until we're ready." The fire crackled softly, filling the room with momentary warmth. Camille exhaled slowly, folding her hands together. "If the let is as dangerous as you say, setting this trap will put you at the center of it," she warned. "He won't hesitate to remove you." "Such a removal will cripple our ability to collaborate properly. I'm prepared to do the unthinkable." Étienne's eyes flickered with resolve. "I'm counting on it." The following evening, Étienne and Camille made their way through the rain-slick streets of Paris, the soft glow of lanterns guiding them toward the docks along the Seine. "Madame Rottiot," she said to the driver who stopped at a sign pretending to read. Étienne wore a dark cloak pulled tightly around his frame, the mask Henri had left him tucked beneath his coat. Camille followed closely, her steps light but deliberate. They arrived at a narrow warehouse that loomed over the river's edge, its wooden beams darkened by years of neglect. A single lantern flickered near the entrance, where Henri waited, his silver mask glinting faintly beneath the light. "You're late," Henri muttered, as Étienne approached. Étienne's sharp eyes narrowed. "This isn't exactly an official engagement." Henri's gaze drifted to Camille, but he said nothing, stepping aside to allow them inside. The warehouse stretched into the darkness, the faint scent of damp wood and rust hanging heavy in the air. The helmsman, Henri, led them toward the far end, where several crates had been arranged into a rough meeting space. A few scattered candles flickered along the edges of the room, casting faint pools of light. Étienne set the mask down on one of the crates, his fingers lingering over the porcelain surface. "Valet won't wait long," Henry warned, crossing his arms. "Once he senses movement against him, he'll respond swiftly." Tessian's jaw tightened. "That's the plan." Henri studied him for a long moment, the faintest flicker of concern beneath his stoic expression. "Be careful, Étienne. Valette doesn't play fair." Étienne's gaze hardened. "Neither do I." The masquerade at the Palais Royal was a distant memory by the time Étienne returned to the heart of Paris's underbelly. The meeting was set for midnight at an abandoned theatre along Rue Saint-Denis, one of the Faceless's known gathering places. Étienne arrived alone, his steps muffled by the thick fog that clung to the city's narrow alleyways. The theatre loomed ahead, its stone facade crumbling beneath the weight of time. Étienne's hand rested lightly on the revolver beneath his coat as he stepped inside, the door creaking softly behind him. Rows of broken seats stretched toward the stage, where a single candle burned at the center. Shadows moved along the edges of the theatre, their presence felt more than seen. Valette emerged from the wings, his crimson mask gleaming in the low light. "I must admit, Morel," Valette began, his voice smooth but edged with malice, "I didn't expect you to come alone." Étienne stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "I thought it best to speak plainly." Valette's gaze narrowed beneath the mask. "A dangerous choice, one that might cost you." Étienne's lips curved faintly. "You seem nervous, Valette. Afraid someone might be listening?" Valet's posture stiffened slightly, but he masked it well. "I've nothing to fear from you, detective," Valette replied coldly. Étienne's eyes flickered to the shadows along the theatre's edge. "No, but perhaps you should fear the men standing behind you." "Ah!" Valette's head tilted slightly, but before he could respond, footsteps echoed from the far end of the theatre. Henri emerged, flanked by two masked figures. "Valette," Henri greeted, his voice calm but firm. "You've overstepped." Valette's eyes burned beneath the mask. "This is not your concern, Henri." Étienne stepped closer, his voice low but cutting. "It became his concern the moment you killed Alain Laurent. The Faceless value secrecy, but your arrogance threatens to destroy that." Valette's jaw tightened, but Henri's calm presence seemed to shift the balance. "You've drawn too much attention," Henri said evenly. "The detective lives because the Faceless allow it, but if you continue down this path, even they won't protect you." For the first time, doubt flickered in Valette's eyes. Étienne pressed forward. "Walk away, Valette. Tonight, or the next mask that falls might be yours." A long silence stretched between them before Valette finally turned, disappearing into the shadows without another word. Henri met Étienne's gaze, nodding faintly. The first crack had formed, and Étienne knew the rest of the facade wouldn't hold for long. Étienne watched Valette's silhouette dissolve into the darkened wings of the theatre. The tension in the room lingered like smoke from a snuffed candle, curling around the masked figures that remained in the shadows. Henri approached with measured steps, his silver mask glinting faintly beneath the flickering candlelight. The two masked figures behind him remained still, their expressions hidden, but Étienne could feel their scrutiny, piercing through the dimness. "You forced his hand," Henri muttered, his voice low enough that only Étienne could hear. "But that was dangerous, even for you." Étienne's gaze stayed fixed on the shadows Valette had vanished into. "Men like him don't respond to half-measures." He glanced sideways at his brother. "This isn't over." Henri's jaw tightened beneath his mask. "No, it's not. But tonight you've shifted the scales. Valette won't act recklessly now that the others doubt him." Étienne crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. "That won't stop him for long. He'll strike from a different angle. One I won't see coming." Henri's silence was answer enough. The masked figures by the walls began to drift away, melting back into the unseen corridors of the theatre like ghosts retreating to their crypts. The fragile alliance within the Faceless had been bruised but not broken. Étienne knew this was merely the beginning of a longer battle, one that would leave scars, seen or otherwise. As the last of the Faceless exited, Étienne finally let out the breath he had been holding. Henri removed his mask, cradling it loosely in one hand. "You shouldn't have come alone," Henri said, glancing around the empty theatre. Étienne's lips curved faintly. "I wasn't." At the far end of the rows of broken seats, Camille stepped into the light. Her gloved hands rested on the edge of the nearest chair, and though she had remained silent, her eyes missed nothing. Mark's eyes grew wide with terror. Henry's brow lifted slightly. "She shouldn't be here." Étienne met his gaze. "She has more reason than most." Camille's voice cut softly through the space between them. "Did Valette look shaken to you?" Henry studied her carefully, as though assessing the weight behind her words. "He did. But a man like Valette never lets fear guide him for long, and she has them," he added. Étienne stepped toward Camille, his hand brushing her elbow as they prepared to leave. "That's why we need to make sure he stays afraid." The streets of Paris lay quiet beneath the waning moon as the three of them exited the theatre. The air was cold, the rain from earlier now nothing more than a damp sheen across the cobblestones. Étienne's eyes swept along the darkened alleyways, his senses heightened. "You've made a powerful enemy," Henri said softly, walking beside him as they crossed the narrow square. "Valette will come after you, sooner or later." Étienne's hand instinctively brushed the revolver beneath his coat. "I'll be ready." Henri paused at the edge of the street, where the gas lamps flickered weakly in the mist. "I can only shield you from so much. Even the Faceless have limits." Étienne met his brother's gaze beneath the flicker of the lamplight. "I never asked for your protection, Henri." André's eyes softened, but there was an undeniable weight behind them, one of a man who had walked a path he couldn't return from. "I know," Henri replied quietly, "but it doesn't mean I'll stop trying." With that, Henri melted into the night, his silhouette swallowed by the twisting alleys of Paris. Camille watched him leave, her expression unreadable. "Do you believe him?" "Il som malo mesabili masculini caristicir, a plesca kerstichin, el plesca kersticir." "I believe he's telling the truth, but truth isn't the same as loyalty." "Ah." They walked in silence for several blocks, the soft patter of their footsteps echoing through empty streets. Finally, Camille broke the quiet. "What happens now?" Étienne glanced at her, his eyes hardening with resolve. "Valette's mistake was letting me live tonight. The next one he makes will cost him everything." Camille nodded, her grip tightening on his arm as they pressed on into the city's heart, where shadows watched and the Faceless waited. Chapter 9. Beneath the Veil of Paris. Part 1. The Gathering Storm. Étienne Morel lit a candle in his apartment, the soft flicker casting fleeting shadows across the walls. The city outside lay still, wrapped in the thick hush that followed midnight's toll. Camille Laurence stood by the window, her gaze distant as she peered out over the rooftops of Paris. The weight of the previous night's confrontation with Valette hung heavy in the air, like a storm lingering on the horizon. Etienne broke the silence first. Henri gave us time, but that's all he can offer. Valette won't retreat. He's too entrenched to walk away quietly. Esquire's due his updates for you, Sinkily? Camille's reflection in the window shifted as she turned toward him, her expression guarded. What's our next move, Etienne? Waiting feels like inviting him to strike first. Camille. Etienne leaned against the edge of the desk, his eyes narrowing beneath furrowed brows. We don't wait. Valette operates with confidence because he believes the Faceless will protect him, but they won't tolerate someone who compromises their secrecy. Camille stepped closer, arms crossed tightly over her chest. You want to expose him? Hélène nodded. Not directly. The Faceless won't believe words alone. We need something undeniable, proof that he is using the society for his personal gain. Once they see him as a liability, he'll be discarded. Camille's eyes flickered with skepticism. Barrett's careful. He's hidden from the police and the Faceless for years. What makes you think he'll slip now? Etienne retrieved a folded letter from the desk drawer, its wax seal broken clean through. He handed it to Camille without speaking. She unfolded it slowly, her eyes scanning the crisp handwriting. An invitation? To Valette's estate? To buy the museum estate? Etienne's lips curled faintly. Tomorrow night, a private gathering. Camille's gaze shot up. How did you get this? Etienne's expression darkened. Henri left it for me. He believes Valette is overreaching. This is his way of guiding us towards something incriminating. Yeah, the truth is, we are all perfectly happy to exist in the bookshelf of our own minds. Camille set the letter down carefully, her fingertips brushing over the wax remnants. So, we attend? This is the patch who sows the seeds of stillness. He straightened, his eyes locking onto hers. We attend, but we don't go as guests. The following evening, Etienne and Camille approached the edge of Valette's estate on foot. The house loomed in the mist, an elegant but cold structure that sat apart from the neighbouring villas. The faint hum of conversation and music drifted through the wrought-iron gates, where carriages lined the front entrance beneath gaslit lanterns. Etienne wore a dark overcoat, the familiar weight of the revolver resting against his side beneath the heavy fabric. Camille's attire, a sleek but unstated gown, allowed her to blend seamlessly with the crowd, though the tension in her posture betrayed her unease. Etienne leaned in, his voice low as they passed the gate unnoticed. We need to find a way inside without drawing attention. Camille glanced toward the side of the estate, where narrow servants' entrances led toward the rear gardens. The staff, she whispered. They'll come and go through the back. Etienne nodded, guiding her down the darkened path along the outer wall. They moved swiftly, slipping through the shadows until they reached the side entrance. The door was ajar, left open just enough for them to slip inside. The corridor stretched ahead, lined with polished stone and flickering candle sconces. Etienne signalled for Camille to remain close as they weaved through the lower levels of the estate. From the ballroom above, the faint echo of Valette's voice carried through the floorboards. Etienne paused at the base of a spiral staircase, tilting his head slightly to listen. Tonight, we celebrate not only success, Valette's voice rang out, smooth but laced with quiet authority, but the continued unity of the Faceless. In times such as these, Solidarity ensures survival. Camille's eyes narrowed. Solidarity, she whispered bitterly. Eddie in the hotel kitchen began to noise again. The room was filled with the smell of brown bread and stew and the velvety scents of chocolate chips. Étienne's gaze hardened. Let's see how united they are when the truth comes to light. But they ascended the staircase carefully, emerging near the edge of the ballroom where masked guests mingled beneath crystal chandeliers. The grandeur of the gathering stood in stark contrast to the secrets festering beneath its surface. Étienne's eyes scanned the room until they landed on Valette, who stood near the far end of the ballroom surrounded by a circle of associates. The crimson mask he wore from the Palais Royal masquerade still adorned his face, its golden trim glinting beneath the light. Étienne's fingers twitched toward his revolver, but he steadied himself. Tonight was not for vengeance. It was for truth. Camille leaned in, her voice barely audible. What are we looking for? Étienne's gaze remained fixed on Valette. Anything that ties him to Alain's death. Letters, documents. We won't need much. Just enough to break the facade. Camille's hand brushed his arm lightly. I'll search the upper rooms. Étienne hesitated but nodded. Be careful. If anything seems wrong, leave immediately. She disappeared into the crowd without another word, leaving Étienne to navigate the gathering alone. Fernande said the word the man had mentioned here. Alone. He approached the bar, lingering near the edge of Valette's circle of guests, listening carefully. The man beside Valette spoke in hushed tones. And the detective? Valette's lips curled faintly. He's no longer a concern. Étienne's eyes narrowed. Valette continued, his voice low but audible. The faceless stand by me. As long as that remains true, Morel's presence will not interfere with our work. Étienne's hand tightened around his glass. He had heard enough. He slipped away from the bar, crossing the ballroom swiftly toward the staircase. Camille moved quietly through the upper level of Lat's estate, her gloved hands brushing along the edges of gilded picture frames and polished bookshelves. The corridor was silent, save for the faint hum of conversation below, and you heard them talking about her. Étienne had been right. If Valette held incriminating evidence, it would be kept somewhere close. She paused at the edge of an ornate wooden door, the faintest sliver of candlelight slipping through the gap beneath it. Camille pressed her ear to the door, listening carefully. Hearing nothing, she eased it open and slipped inside. The room was a study, lined with towering shelves of leather-bound volumes. At the center, a large mahogany desk stood beneath an open window, the curtains billowing gently in the cool night air. Papers were scattered across the desk, but Camille's attention was drawn to the edge, where a black ledger sat partially concealed beneath a pile of correspondence. She crossed the room swiftly, flipping open the ledger. Her breath caught as she scanned the names written across the pages. Prominent bankers, merchants, and Alain Lehormand? Camille's fingers trembled as she traced her husband's name, her heart pounding with each entry, detailing payments and meetings. Camille. She turned sharply to find Étienne standing in the doorway, his eyes locking onto the ledger in her hands. "We have what we need," she whispered, holding the book toward him. Étienne approached, flipping through the pages. "This will end him," Étienne murmured. But before they could move, the door creaked behind them. Valette stepped into the room, his mask now resting in his hand. His eyes flickered with cold amusement. "I wondered when you'd find your way up here." Étienne's revolver was in his hand instantly, aimed at Valette's chest. "You'll change the minds of others." The subtext predicts that the exercises included in the adventuring game. Valette's smirk never wavered. "Do you think killing me will stop this?" Étienne's eyes burned with fury. "I don't need to kill you. Your ledger will do that for me." Valet's expression darkened, but Étienne and Camille were already slipping out the door, the ledger tucked safely beneath Étienne's coat. Étienne's grip on Camille's wrist tightened as they slipped through the dim corridor, the weight of the ledger pressed firmly against his side. The faint glow of candlelight flickered along the walls as they moved swiftly, shadows trailing behind them like ghosts of the secrets they now carried. Behind them, Valet's footsteps echoed, deliberate but unhurried. He wasn't chasing them. He was following, as if daring them to make a mistake. "Keep moving," Étienne whispered, guiding Camille down the narrow staircase that led to the servants' exit they had used to enter. He stopped to turn the key. Camille's heart pounded, her breathing shallow as she kept pace. "He's not calling for his guards," she murmured. Étienne's gaze remained fixed ahead. "He doesn't need to. He believes we won't make it out." As they reached the lower level, the soft hum of conversation from the ballroom filtered faintly through the walls. Étienne paused just before the archway that led to the main hall, pressing Camille back against the cold stone. Through the thin gap between the heavy drapes, he caught sight of masked figures lingering near the entrance. 3 men standing rigid, their attention fixed toward the upper levels, as if anticipating their descent. "Valet's already signaled them," Étienne muttered under his breath. Camille's eyes narrowed as she peered around the corner. "We're trapped." Étienne's mind raced. They couldn't confront Valet's guards directly, not in the heart of his estate, not while he was skilled in archery. To get lucky, he had to work his way towards Valet. First, he needed to catch Valet off. "There's another way out," he whispered, glancing toward the far end of the corridor. "The wine cellar. It leads to the gardens behind the estate." Camille nodded, following close as Étienne guided her through the narrow passage that twisted beneath the ballroom floor. The cellar stretched before them, rows of barrels lining the stone walls. Étienne's lantern flickered, casting long shadows as they navigated deeper into the cold, musky chamber. The faint scent of aged wine lingered, mingling with the damp earth beneath their feet. Étienne approached the far wall, pressing his hand against a narrow wooden panel hidden behind the barrels. With a soft click, the panel slid open, revealing a passageway barely wide enough for a single person to squeeze through. "This leads to the gardens," Étienne whispered. Camille hesitated for a brief moment, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting Valet to appear behind them. "How did you know about this?" Valet paused, and then turned to Swithin. Étienne's lips curled faintly. "Valet isn't the first powerful man to hide escape routes in his home." She slipped inside, and Étienne followed, pulling the panel shut behind them. The tunnel twisted in uneven patterns, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the damp soil. Étienne led the way, the faint glow of distant lanterns growing stronger as they neared the garden entrance. As they emerged into the cool night air, the sprawling gardens stretched ahead, their path lit only by the soft silver glow of the moon. The iron gate that led to the outer streets stood a short distance away, but Étienne knew better than to let his guard down. Camille exhaled softly, relief flickering across her face. "We made it." Étienne's eyes didn't leave the gate. "Not yet." As they crossed the garden, a faint rustle in the hedges to their left sent a cold shiver down Étienne's spine. "Stop!" he whispered, drawing his revolver. Camille froze, her breath caught in her throat. A figure stepped into view, emerging from the shadows near the edge of the estate. Henri. His silver mask gleamed beneath the moonlight, but his posture was tense, his eyes flicking toward the tunnel they had just left. "Étienne," Henri said quietly, lowering his mask, "you took the ledger." Étienne's grip on the revolver relaxed slightly, but his gaze remained wary. "You left the invitation for me. This is what you wanted." Henri's eyes darkened. "I wanted you to see the truth, not ignite a war." Camille stepped forward, her voice sharp. "There's no war to ignite. Valette killed my husband and left him in the gutter like an animal. You knew this." Valentia. Henri's expression tightened. "Valette won't let you leave Paris alive with that ledger. You know that, Étienne." Étienne stepped closer to his brother, eyes burning with quiet resolve. "If he wanted me dead tonight, I wouldn't have left the estate." Henri's gaze flickered with uncertainty. "You think he'll let this go?" Venus's attempted brightness seemed timid by comparison. "No," Étienne replied, "but I'm counting on him to try." The silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Henri stepped aside, gesturing toward the gate. "I'll give you until morning," Henri murmured. "After that, I can't protect you." Étienne nodded but said nothing as he guided Camille toward the gate. As they disappeared into the night, Henri stood beneath the moonlight, watching his brother vanish into the streets of Paris. His fingers tightened around the silver mask at his side, and for the first time in years he felt something he hadn't expected. Now, Étienne and Camille walked in silence through the empty streets, their footsteps echoing faintly along the damp cobblestones. When they finally reached Étienne's apartment, Camille sank into the chair by the fire, exhaustion etched into her features. Étienne set the ledger down on the table, staring at it for a long moment. "We'll take this to the police tomorrow?" Camille asked, her voice soft. "Ah." Étienne's eyes flickered with hesitation. "Not yet." Camille's brow furrowed. "Why not?" Étienne's gaze darkened. "Because Verlette isn't the only one watching. The faceless are still out there, and if we expose Verlette without unraveling the rest of them, we may not live long enough to see justice done." Maman's expression hardened, but she nodded in understanding. "So what do we do now?" she asked. Étienne leaned against the edge of the desk, his eyes fixed on the flames crackling in the hearth. "We find the others," Étienne replied, his voice resolute, "and we pull them into the light." Chapter 10, The Final Mask. The wind swept through the streets of Paris like a whisper of forgotten secrets, tugging at the edges of Étienne Morel's coat as he stood on the balcony overlooking the Seine. The city below hummed softly with life, unaware of the storm building in the shadows. Behind him, the black ledger from Valette's estate lay open on the desk, each page heavy with names that carried weight in the underworld. The architects of power that ruled from behind the curtain. Alain Laurent's name was scrawled among them, tied to meeting dates and transactions that no honest man would claim. Étienne's fingers traced the edge of the ledger, his mind racing. This wasn't just about Valette anymore. The ledger was a map, a guide to the hidden order shaping Paris. And if what he suspected was true, the faceless wouldn't let it leave the city. The clock on the mantel struck 11. Étienne glanced over his shoulder as Camille stepped from the adjoining room, her eyes hard with quiet determination. She wore a dark cloak, its folds gathered tightly around her, masking her presence. "You're certain about this?" Camille asked, folding her arms. Étienne nodded. "Valet will make his move tonight. The ledger's too dangerous to him. If he doesn't try to kill me, he'll send someone else to do it." Camille stepped closer, lowering her voice. "And if the faithless protect him?" Blowing the cobwebs away. The weight of the words settled between them. Camille's hand brushed his arm lightly. "Whatever happens tonight, we finish this," she said softly. Étienne's eyes met hers briefly, and he nodded. A soft knock at the door shattered the quiet. Étienne drew his revolver, nodding for Camille to step behind the curtains. As he approached the door, the knock came again, 3 slow raps, deliberate and calm. Étienne opened it to find Henri standing in the hall, his silver mask dangling from his hand. "You knew I'd come," Henri said, stepping inside without invitation. Étienne closed the door softly behind him, lowering his weapon. "I'd have been disappointed if you hadn't." Henri's eyes drifted to the ledger on the desk. "You should have destroyed it." Étienne crossed his arms, his gaze steady. "Why didn't you?" Henri exhaled, his fingers tightening around the mask. "I thought I could control it. Control Valette. But he's not like the others. He won't fall quietly into the shadows. If you expose him with that ledger, the faceless will tear themselves apart." Étienne's lips curled faintly. "Good." Henri's expression hardened. "You don't understand, Étienne. If the faceless fracture, the people who step in to replace Valette will be worse. The ledger doesn't bring justice. It shifts power. Is that what you want?" Étienne's eyes darkened. "I want him to pay for what he did to Alain Laurent and to Camille." "What?" Henri's gaze flicked toward the curtain, where Camille lingered just out of sight. Étienne's voice dropped lower. "You had your chance to stop him, Henri. Now it's my turn." The silence between them thickened, until Henri finally relented, setting the silver mask down on the desk. "If you're set on this," Henri murmured, "then you'll need more than just evidence. You need to be seen." Étienne frowned. "What do you mean?" Henri's eyes narrowed. "The facialists are gathering tonight, not at Valette's estate, at Saint-Pierre-des-Lombards." Étienne's pulse quickened. "The chapel?" he said. Henri nodded. "A final meeting. If Valette believes you'll expose him, he'll confront you there." Étienne retrieved his coat, sliding the ledger beneath the folds of fabric. "Then we'll be ready." Henri's hand caught his arm as he moved toward the door. "No," Henri said quietly, "not we. You can't bring Camille into this," Hirag said. Étienne's gaze hardened. "She stays with me." Henri's eyes flickered with warning, but he said nothing more. As they left the apartment, Camille at his side, Étienne knew the night would not end quietly. The faceless waited, and tonight one of their masks would fall for the last time. The chapel of Saint-Pierre-Lombards loomed over the narrow square, its ancient stonework crumbling under the weight of centuries. Étienne led Camille through the shadows, his hand lingering near the revolver beneath his coat. A faint glow flickered beyond the chapel doors, illuminating the edges of the stained glass with molten gold. "Are you ready?" Étienne asked, his voice low. Camille nodded, pulling the hood of her cloak higher. "I've been ready since the night Alain disappeared." Étienne pushed the heavy door open, and together they stepped inside. The chapel was nearly empty, save for Valette standing at the far end, his crimson mask in place, flanked by two cloaked figures. The air hung heavy with incense, the faint hum of whispered conversation fading as Étienne approached. "I wondered how long it would take you to come," Valette said smoothly, his voice echoing off the stone walls. Embracing his mysterious eyes locked onto him. "I thought it fitting to deliver this in person." He produced the ledger, letting it fall heavily onto the nearest pew. Morel said. Valec's eyes narrowed beneath the mask. "That book won't save you," Valette murmured, taking a step closer. "The faceless stand with me." Étienne's lips curled faintly. "We'll see." At that moment, the side door to the chapel creaked open, and Henri entered, his silver mask glinting faintly in the low light. He moved silently to stand between Valette and Étienne, his presence heavy with unspoken tension. Valette's gaze flickered to Henri. "You told him, didn't you?" Henri's expression remained impassive. "Your mistakes told him everything." Valette's eyes darkened. He took another step forward, the weight of his authority pressing down on the room. You think you can stand against me, Étienne?" Valette whispered. "Look around. This city belongs to men like me. You're a ghost in your own streets. At least, that's what you think you are. Étienne's voice cut through the quiet. "No, Valette, I'm the one who haunts men like you." The tension snapped like a rope pulled too tightly. Valet's hand moved toward the dagger at his waist. Étienne's revolver was already raised. "I wouldn't," Étienne warned. For a long moment, no one moved. Finally, Valet's hand dropped to his side. Henri stepped forward, lifting the ledger from the pew. "I've got it." "This ends tonight," Henri said softly. René's mask lowered, revealing eyes filled not with fear, but cold acceptance. Étienne watched as Valette turned, walking toward the entrance of the chapel. "Thérèse forgets," Valette murmured as he passed Étienne. "But I won't," Étienne replied. As the chapel doors closed behind Valette, Étienne felt the weight of the night finally lift. Étienne said. The faceless had lost their face. The heavy oak doors of Saint-Pierre-de-Lombard's groaned shut behind Valette, leaving Étienne, Camille, and Henri alone beneath the fractured glow of candlelight. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with the weight of unspoken questions and the knowledge that the night's work was far from over. Or so. Étienne lowered his revolver, but his grip remained firm. The ledger rested in Henri's hands like a fragile artifact, the inked names inside damning enough to shatter the fragile order of Paris's underworld. The Chancelier stared at it, and then at the coroner. "He won't run," Camille said softly, stepping closer to Étienne's side. Her eyes followed the path Valette had taken, her voice steady, but lined with tension. "Men like him don't disappear without leaving scars behind." Étienne nodded, his gaze fixed on the door. "No, he'll try to erase us first." Henri's voice cut through the stillness, cold and certain. "He'll gather what's left of his supporters. This isn't over." Étienne's eyes narrowed. "I don't intend to let him rebuild." Henri set the ledger carefully onto the altar, his movements deliberate as though placing a relic upon sacred ground. He stepped back, letting out a breath that seemed to echo against the ancient stone walls. "It won't be long before the others hear what's happened tonight," Henri said, his voice low. "Valette's hold on the faithless is slipping, but fear is a dangerous motivator. If he convinces them that we're the greater threat, they'll come for us. So," Étienne's eyes never left the entrance, "then we don't wait for them to come." Camille's hand brushed his arm lightly, drawing his attention. Her hazel eyes reflected the flicker of candlelight, but beneath them burned something else. Resolve. "There's another way," Camille said quietly. "You said the faceless thrive in secrecy. If we expose the let in the light of day, there'll be no more shadows left for him to hide behind." Étienne glanced at Henri, watching as his brother's expression hardened. "She's right," Henri murmured. "Valette survives because he controls the narrative. If that ledger reaches the right hands, he won't have the protection of the faceless anymore." Étienne exhaled slowly. Henri met his gaze, eyes unreadable beneath the faint scar that traced his jawline. "Then we make sure they can't look away." Henri peered at his friend with curiosity. Henri felt immediate relief. Étienne nodded. "The ledger goes public." Camille's grip on his arm tightened slightly. "And Valette?" Étienne's voice lowered to a whisper. "I'll handle Valette." Henri stepped forward, lifting the ledger carefully from the altar. "I'll take this to the newspapers tonight, but Valette won't let me walk freely if he realizes what I carry." Étienne's hand hovered near his revolver. "You'll have protection." Henri's eyes flicked to Camille. "I need you with me." Camille hesitated. "I should stay with Étienne." "No," Étienne interrupted gently. "Go with Henri. The faceless know me. If I'm seen moving openly tonight, they'll be watching. I need to track Valette before he disappears." Camille's brow furrowed, but she didn't argue. Instead, she stepped to Henri's side, offering Etienne a brief nod. Henri adjusted his coat, sliding the ledger beneath the folds of fabric. "We'll meet at the café on Rue des Abessis when this is done." He nodded once. "Be careful." As they slipped through the chapel's side entrance, leaving Etienne alone beneath the vaulted ceiling, a faint breeze stirred the candles, casting shadows that danced across the stone walls. The night would end in blood. Etienne emerged onto the rain-slick streets of Paris, the gas lamps stretching his shadow long across the cobblestones. The city was quiet, save for the distant hum of life that whispered from behind shuttered windows. His instincts carried him down the winding alleyways toward the river, following the current that mirrored the pulse of Paris's underworld. Valet wouldn't flee, not yet. Etienne knew men like him. Predators didn't run, they stalked. As he approached Pont-Neuf, a figure materialized beneath the lamplight, waiting on the bridge's edge like a spectre from a half-forgotten dream. Etienne's hand tightened around the revolver hidden beneath his coat. "Valette," Etienne called softly, stepping into the light. Valette turned slowly, his crimson mask now discarded, revealing a face carved by years of quiet cruelty. His eyes glinted in the faint glow, calm but edged with the weight of inevitability. "I thought you'd come," Valette said, his voice smooth as ever. Etienne's footsteps echoed softly as he advanced. "You left the door open for me." Valette's lips curled faintly. "I don't believe in running, Morel. I assume you feel the same." Etienne's revolver was out in a heartbeat, aimed squarely at Valette's chest. "Etienne a des pactons." "I've got no interest in games tonight," Etienne warned. "Your hold on the faceless is gone. Henri is delivering the ledger as we speak. It's over." Valette's eyes narrowed slightly, but his smile never faded. "You think exposing me will change anything?" Valette asked, taking a slow step forward. "Paris forgets, detective. In a week they'll have a new villain to hate." "Ah!" Paris laughed, and rummaged in a desk drawer, bringing out a bottle of blood. Etienne's finger hovered over the trigger. "Not this time," Etienne replied. Valette's gaze darkened. He stopped mere feet away, eyes cold and sharp. "You're not leaving this bridge," Valette whispered. Etienne's heart slowed. He saw the glint of the knife an instant before Valette lunged. Etienne fired once, the shot cracking through the night air. Valette staggered, the knife slipping from his grip as crimson bloomed beneath his coat. He collapsed to his knees, gasping as the rain began to fall. Essa knelt beside him, watching as the light faded from Valette's eyes. "You brought this on yourself," Etienne murmured, holstering his weapon. Valette's hand trembled once, then stilled. The final mask had fallen. By dawn, the headlines across Paris told the story. Paris, the Greek, powerful merchant and criminal, tied to mysterious faceless society, found dead on Pont-Neuf. The ledger had reached the papers. The faceless disbanded quietly in the days that followed, their secrets dragged into the light, and the city, though shaken, endured. Etienne stood by Camille on the steps of the café where they had agreed to meet Henri. As they watched the city come to life beneath the soft glow of morning, Camille's voice broke the silence. "Ha! Is it over?" Etienne's gaze lingered on the horizon. "For now," he replied. But beneath the streets, in forgotten corners of the city, Paris's shadows continued to shift.